In the days of ancient Israel, the land was filled with turmoil and strife. The people of Israel, chosen by God and led by King Saul, were once again at war with their enemies, the Philistines. The Philistines were a powerful and fearsome people, known for their warriors and their mighty weapons of war. Both armies gathered on opposite hills, separated by the wide expanse of the valley of Elah, waiting for battle. The air was thick with tension, as the soldiers of Israel stood in fear of the challenge that faced them. At the heart of this standoff was a single, towering figure, a giant among men whose presence alone sent waves of terror through the Israelite camp. His name was Goliath, a warrior from the Philistine city of Gath, whose size and strength were unmatched by any mortal man. Goliath stood over 9 feet tall, his body covered in thick armor made of bronze, gleaming in the sunlight. He carried a massive spear, its iron tip as heavy as a weaver's beam, and his shield was borne by an attendant who marched before him. For 40 days Goliath had come down to the valley, issuing a challenge to the Israelites. His voice, deep and menacing, echoed across the hills. "Why have you come out to line up for battle?" he would shout. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man to come down and fight me. If he can kill me, we will be your servants. But if I kill him, you will be our servants and serve us." Day after day, Goliath taunted the Israelites, mocking them and their God. His challenge was simple, a duel to determine the fate of the two nations. The Philistine army stood behind him, confident in their champion's strength, while the men of Israel trembled in fear. None dared to face Goliath, for who could stand against such a giant? Who could hope to defeat a man so fearsome, so strong, and so experienced in the ways of war? In the camp of the Israelites, fear had taken hold. Even King Saul, once a mighty warrior, was paralyzed by the sight of Goliath. Every day the soldiers would hear Goliath's voice booming through the valley, but none would step forward to face him. Hope seemed to be slipping away, and with it, the courage of Israel's fighting men. But far from the battlefield, in the quiet hills of Bethlehem, there was a young shepherd boy named David. David was the youngest son of Jesse, a humble man who raised sheep in the fields. Though young, David was brave and had a heart full of faith in God. He had spent many long days tending his father's sheep, guarding them from wild animals and dangers that roamed the countryside. Armed with only a sling and his courage, David had fought off lions and bears to protect his flock, trusting that God was with him in every moment. One day, Jesse sent David to the battlefield to bring food to his brothers, who were among the soldiers of Israel. David, eager to see the battle and help his family, set out with bread and grain, unaware that this simple task would soon lead him to face a challenge greater than any he had ever known. As he arrived at the camp, David heard the sound of Goliath's taunts, echoing through the valley, louder and more threatening than anything he had ever heard. David's heart stirred within him as he listened to the giant mock the armies of Israel, and, worse yet, the God of Israel. How could this uncircumcised Philistine, this enemy of the living God, dare to defy the armies of the Lord? David, though young and without armor, was filled with righteous anger. He could not believe that no one had stepped forward to defend the honor of God and the people of Israel. As David wandered through the camp, speaking to the soldiers and inquiring about Goliath, his eldest brother Eliab scolded him. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab said. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You have come down to see the battle." But David replied, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" David's words soon reached King Saul, and the young shepherd boy was brought before the king. Standing in Saul's tent, surrounded by battle-hardened warriors, David spoke with a confidence that seemed beyond his years. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David said. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul looked at David, astonished. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," Saul said. "You are only a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David was undeterred. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," David said. "And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, hearing the faith in David's voice, agreed to let him face Goliath. But even as David prepared for battle, no one could have known the extraordinary victory that was about to unfold. The shepherd boy, armed with nothing but a sling and a handful of stones, was about to face the greatest warrior the world had ever known. Chapter 1. The Shepherd and the Giant. As the sun rose higher over the valley, the armies of Israel and Philistia stood facing each other in the tense silence, but the battle was far from beginning. Day after day, the Philistines sent forth their champion Goliath, and day after day, the men of Israel trembled in fear. But on this particular day, something had changed. Among the ranks of Israel was no mighty warrior, no seasoned general, but a young shepherd boy named David, who had come not to fight, but to deliver food to his brothers. Little did anyone know, however, that this young boy was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. David, the youngest son of Jesse, was a shepherd by trade. His days were spent in the quiet hills of Bethlehem, where he tended his father's sheep with care and diligence. Though young in years, David had already proven himself to be brave and resourceful, defending his flock from lions and bears with only his sling and his faith in God. He was no warrior, but he possessed a strength that came from a deep and abiding trust in the Lord. When David arrived at the Israelite camp, he was shocked to find the soldiers cowering in fear at the sight of Goliath. The giant, clad in gleaming bronze armor, stood in the valley, his voice booming across the battlefield as he issued his daily challenge. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" Goliath roared. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." David could hardly believe what he was hearing. This Philistine, this giant, was mocking not only the armies of Israel, but the God of Israel himself. And worse still, no one dared to accept the challenge. The soldiers whispered among themselves, speaking of the rewards Saul had promised to the man who would defeat Goliath: great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and freedom from taxes for his family. Yet, despite the temptations, not one man stepped forward to face the giant. David's heart burned within him. How could these men, the chosen people of God, stand by while this uncircumcised Philistine defied the living God? Where was their faith? Where was their courage? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asked, his voice carrying a note of righteous anger. His words caught the attention of his eldest brother, Eliab, who scolded him harshly. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demanded. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You have come down to watch the battle." But David, undeterred, replied, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" David's boldness soon reached the ears of King Saul, who summoned the young shepherd to his tent. When Saul saw David standing before him, he was struck by the boy's youth and inexperience. This was no warrior, no battle-hardened soldier, but a mere boy. Yet there was something in David's eyes, something that spoke of a deep and unshakable faith. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David said confidently. "Your servant will go and fight him." Saul could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him," the king said. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David was undeterred. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," he explained. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, hearing the conviction in David's voice, relented. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." Saul, in an attempt to give David a fighting chance, offered him his own armor. The king's breastplate, helmet, and sword were placed upon the young shepherd, but they were far too heavy for David, who had never worn such things before. After struggling for a moment, David removed the armor and handed it back to Saul. "I cannot go in these," he said simply, "because I am not used to them." Instead, David chose to face Goliath armed with only the tools he had always relied on, the tools of a shepherd. He took his sling, and as he made his way toward the battlefield, he stopped at a nearby brook and carefully selected 5 smooth stones, placing them in the pouch at his side. With his staff in hand and his sling ready, David stepped into the valley where Goliath waited, his heart filled with faith. As David approached, Goliath's eyes narrowed in disdain. The giant could hardly believe what he was seeing. A boy, unarmed and without armor, walking toward him with nothing but a sling. His voice rang out across the valley, filled with scorn. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath jeered. "Come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But David, undeterred by the giant's taunts, replied, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." With those words, David's faith was sealed. The battle was not his alone. It belonged to God. And as he stood before the towering giant, he knew with every fiber of his being that God would deliver him. Chapter 2. The Simple Weapon. The valley fell silent as David stood face to face with Goliath, the massive figure who towered over him like a great mountain. The Philistine soldiers on one side and the Israelite army on the other watched in disbelief. How could this young boy, with no armor and no sword, possibly hope to defeat the mightiest warrior of the Philistines? Goliath, in his heavy bronze armor, carried weapons of war, a spear as tall as a tree, and a sword that gleamed in the sunlight. His shield-bearer stood before him, ready to protect his giant master. In contrast, David appeared insignificant, with only a shepherd's sling, a staff, and 5 smooth stones. Despite the odds, David remained calm. His heart was not filled with fear, but with an unshakable confidence in the Lord, the God of Israel. He did not see Goliath as an indomitable force, but as just another obstacle in the path of faith. The battle, David knew, was not his to fight alone. It was the Lord's. And with God's power behind him, no enemy, no matter how large or fearsome, could stand in his way. Goliath, unaware of the divine strength that guided David's actions, sneered at the boy before him. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath roared, his voice echoing across the valley. The giant's anger and pride were clear in his voice, and his muscles tensed as he prepared to strike David down with a single blow. "Come here," Goliath growled, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But David, standing tall in his faith, responded with a calm that seemed impossible in the face of such danger. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David said, his voice strong and unwavering. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, and everyone gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As David spoke these words, his confidence grew even stronger, for he knew that his strength came not from his own abilities, but from the power of God. Goliath, with all his weapons and armor, was nothing compared to the might of the God of Israel. David's weapon, a simple sling, might have seemed inadequate, but in the hands of a servant of God, it was more than enough. With deliberate calm, David reached into the pouch at his side and drew out one of the 5 smooth stones he had gathered from the brook. Each stone had been carefully chosen for its smoothness and weight, and David knew that his skill with the sling would make these stones deadly in battle. But this was no ordinary fight. As David placed the stone into the sling and began to whirl it above his head, his heart was steady, his faith unshaken. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. Not in the battlefields of men, but in the quiet fields of Bethlehem, where he had learned to defend his father's sheep from lions and bears. As Goliath advanced toward him, expecting an easy victory, David remained light on his feet, moving with the swiftness of a shepherd who had spent his life in the fields. His movements were fluid and natural, guided by years of practice and the guiding hand of God. The sling whirled faster and faster in the air, making a faint whooshing sound as it spun above his head. Suddenly, without hesitation, David released the stone from his sling. Time seemed to slow as the stone flew through the air, straight and true. It was not guided by mere chance or skill, it was guided by the hand of God. The stone struck Goliath directly on the forehead, sinking deep into the giant's skull with a dull thud. For a moment, Goliath stood frozen, his massive body swaying slightly as if his mind was struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The armies on both sides held their breath, the silence so complete that the sound of the wind rustling through the valley seemed deafening. Then, in a great crash of armor, Goliath fell. The giant, who had taunted and terrorized the Israelites for 40 days, lay lifeless on the ground. His mighty body, once a symbol of invincibility, was now a testament to the power of faith. The shock wave of what had just happened rippled through both armies. The Philistines, who had placed all their confidence in Goliath's strength, stared in disbelief at their fallen champion. The Israelites, who had been paralyzed with fear just moments before, suddenly found their courage rekindled. David had done what no man had dared to attempt. He had defeated the giant, not with a sword or a spear, but with a simple stone and his unwavering faith in God. But David was not finished. Moving swiftly, he ran toward Goliath's fallen body. The weight of what he had accomplished had not yet settled in, but David knew that this victory was not his alone. It belonged to God. He stood over Goliath and, drawing the giant's own sword from its sheath, cut off Goliath's head, sealing the victory in the sight of both armies. With the head of their champion severed and their hopes shattered, the Philistines panicked. Their mighty warrior had fallen, and with him their courage. In terror, they turned and fled, running back toward their homeland, no longer willing to fight against the people of Israel, whose God had delivered such a miraculous victory. The Israelite army, emboldened by David's faith and triumph, surged forward in pursuit of the fleeing Philistines. The battlefield, once filled with fear and doubt, was now alive with the sounds of victory. The men of Israel chased their enemies from the valley, driving them back to the gates of Ekron and Gath, leaving the bodies of their fallen foes scattered across the road. As the dust of battle settled, David stood once more in the valley, holding the giant's sword in his hand. But there was no sense of arrogance or pride in his heart. He knew that this victory had come not through his own strength, but through the power of God. He had been but an instrument in the hands of the Lord, and it was God who had delivered the victory that day. The simplicity of David's weapon, a sling and a stone, stood in stark contrast to the might of Goliath's armor and weapons. Yet it was this very simplicity that underscored the greatness of the victory. David had shown that true strength does not come from the tools of war, but from the faith and trust placed in God. Chapter 3. The Battle Begins. As Goliath's enormous form hit the ground with a resounding crash, the tension that had gripped the valley finally broke. The mighty warrior, feared by the Israelites and revered by the Philistines, lay motionless in the dust. A stunned silence fell over the battlefield as both armies, enemies and allies alike, struggled to comprehend what had just happened. What had been an unthinkable sight only moments before was now reality. A young shepherd boy had felled the greatest warrior of the Philistines with nothing more than a sling and a stone. The Philistines, once filled with pride and confidence in their champion, now stood frozen in disbelief. Goliath had been their strongest, their most fearsome warrior, a man whose mere presence had struck terror into the hearts of Israel's soldiers. But now Goliath lay dead, defeated by someone who should have been no match for him. Panic began to spread through the ranks of the Philistine army. Their hope had been crushed in an instant, and the invincible force they had believed in was gone. On the other side of the valley, the Israelites were equally stunned, but their shock quickly turned to awe. The impossible had happened, and with it, a new surge of hope flooded their hearts. The boy who had stepped forward with nothing but faith had conquered the undefeatable. For 40 days, the Israelites had cowered in fear, unable to meet Goliath's challenge. But now, the sight of his fallen body ignited a fire within them. If David could defeat Goliath with just a stone, surely they too could overcome the enemy before them. Before the Philistines could recover from their shock, David acted. He ran toward Goliath's fallen form with swift and purposeful steps. Reaching the giant, David stood over him, a picture of both triumph and humility. In his hand was the sling that had won the battle, but now, as he looked down at the lifeless form of Goliath, David knew what he had to do to complete the victory. Drawing Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, David raised it high above his head and brought it down with a single powerful strike, severing the giant's head. The sight was both symbolic and final. With the head of their champion removed, the Philistines' hope crumbled completely. What had once been a scene of their domination had now turned into their defeat. David lifted Goliath's head for all to see, and with that action, the tide of the battle turned. The Israelite soldiers, who had moments earlier stood paralyzed with fear, now erupted into shouts of victory. Their faith had been restored, their courage rekindled. With David's bold act as the spark, they surged forward as one, charging across the valley toward the retreating Philistines. The Philistines, seeing their champion defeated and their enemies surging toward them, broke into a full retreat. Fear gripped their hearts as they turned and fled, no longer willing to fight. The once proud army, which had boasted of their strength and mocked the Israelites, now scrambled to escape the advancing forces. Their belief in Goliath's invincibility had been shattered, and with it, their will to fight. The Israelites, now filled with new vigor, pursued their enemies relentlessly. They chased the Philistines down the road toward the cities of Ekron and Gath, cutting down their enemies along the way. What had begun as a battle of fear and hesitation had now transformed into a sweeping victory for the people of Israel. David, the young shepherd, stood amidst the battlefield, watching as the Israelites surged forward, pushing the Philistines from the valley. He had no sword of his own, no armor to shield him, but in his hand he still held Goliath's sword, a symbol of the power of faith over fear, of trust in God over reliance on worldly strength. The battle had not been won by might or by weapons, but by the hand of the Lord Almighty, who had delivered his people in their time of need. As the Israelites pressed their advantage, David took a moment to reflect on what had just occurred. He had stepped forward not as a warrior, but as a servant of God, trusting that the battle was the Lord's to win. In his heart, he had known that no giant, no matter how strong or how terrifying, could stand against the God of Israel. And now, as the Philistine army fled in defeat, David knew that his victory was not his own, but a testament to the power of faith. The Israelites continued their pursuit, driving the Philistines all the way to the gates of their cities. Along the road, the bodies of the fallen lay scattered, a grim reminder of the cost of defying the people of God. The valley, once filled with the sounds of Goliath's taunts and the rumble of Philistine armor, now echoed with the triumphant cries of the Israelites. What had begun as a day of fear and uncertainty had ended in a resounding victory. As the battle finally drew to a close, the Israelite soldiers returned to the valley, gathering the spoils of war. They took from the abandoned Philistine camp all that had been left behind in the enemy's hasty retreat. It was a day of great celebration for the people of Israel, a day when their faith had been restored and their enemies had been driven back. David, however, did not linger long on the battlefield. With Goliath's head in hand, he made his way to Jerusalem, where he would present the symbol of his victory. His journey from shepherd to warrior had been swift, but David remained humble, knowing that all he had accomplished had been through God's guidance and strength. In time, King Saul summoned David once again, and as the young man stood before the king, there was no mistaking the respect and awe in Saul's eyes. The boy who had stood before him just hours earlier, offering to fight Goliath with nothing but a sling and a few stones, had now returned victorious, having defeated the greatest warrior the Philistines had ever known. Saul marveled at David's courage, but more than that, he marveled at the quiet faith that had carried him through. David's victory over Goliath became the stuff of legend, a story that would be told and retold for generations. It was a story not just of battle, but of faith, a story that showed that even the mightiest enemies could be defeated when one placed their trust in God. David had faced the impossible, and through God's power, he had overcome. And so, the battle that had begun with fear ended in triumph, a triumph that belonged not to the weapons of men, but to the faith of a young shepherd who believed in the power of the Almighty. David's journey was only beginning, but from that day forward, he would be known not as a simple shepherd, but as a man chosen by God, a man destined for greatness. The tale of David and Goliath is more than just a story of a battle between a young boy and a giant. It is a story of faith, courage, and the power of trusting in something greater than oneself. David's victory over Goliath was not won through strength or weapons, but through his unwavering belief that God would deliver him from the impossible. Though David was just a shepherd boy, he understood something that the most seasoned warriors of Israel had forgotten, that true power comes not from the sword or the spear, but from faith. As David returned to his life after the battle, his story became a source of inspiration for generations to come. He had shown that no obstacle, no matter how great, could stand in the way of a person who places their trust in God. His humility, his courage, and his unshakable faith would be the foundation upon which his future as a great king would be built. The story of David and Goliath reminds us that the challenges we face in life, no matter how overwhelming they may seem, can be overcome when we place our faith in God. It teaches us that we are never alone in our struggles, that even when we feel small and insignificant, God's power can work through us to achieve great things. David's triumph was not just a victory for himself, but a victory for all who believe in the strength of faith. The image of David standing before the fallen Goliath, a simple shepherd boy armed with only a sling, has become a symbol of hope for those who face seemingly insurmountable odds. It reminds us that no matter how great the challenges before us, with faith, we too can overcome the giants in our lives. The story of David and Goliath from 1 Samuel 17 is a timeless narrative about the triumph of faith over fear and the victory of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It begins with the Philistines and Israelites standing on opposite sides of the valley of Elah, locked in a standoff that has persisted for weeks. At the center of this standoff is Goliath, a giant of a man, a warrior unmatched in size and strength. For 40 days, Goliath taunts the Israelites, challenging them to send someone to face him in single combat, but no one dares to take up the challenge until David arrives. David, a young shepherd boy who comes to the battlefield to deliver food to his brothers, is filled with righteous anger at Goliath's defiance of God. While the soldiers of Israel are paralyzed with fear, David volunteers to fight the giant, armed with nothing but his faith, a sling, and 5 smooth stones. King Saul reluctantly agrees to let David go, and with one well-placed stone, David fells Goliath, cutting off his head and securing victory for Israel. David's triumph over Goliath teaches several important lessons. Faith over fear. David was not the strongest, the most experienced, or the best armed warrior on the battlefield, but he had something far greater: faith in God. While the Israelites were gripped with fear, David's trust in God gave him the courage to face the impossible. The story reminds us that when we place our faith in God, we can overcome even the greatest challenges in our lives. God uses the humble. David was not a mighty warrior, but a humble shepherd. Yet God chose him to accomplish something that no one else could. This shows that God often works through those whom the world might overlook or underestimate. It is a reminder that, no matter our status or background, we can be used for great purposes when we place our trust in God. The power of preparation. David did not suddenly acquire the skill to defeat Goliath. His time as a shepherd, protecting his flock from lions and bears, had prepared him for this moment. The story encourages us to recognize that the small tasks we face each day, even when they seem insignificant, are preparing us for greater things. The battle belongs to the Lord. One of the key messages of this story is that the battle does not belong to us alone. It belongs to God. David knew that the outcome was not in his hands, but in God's. His victory was a reminder that it is not by our own strength that we win life's battles, but by the strength of God working through us. Facing the giants in our lives. The story of David and Goliath is often used as a metaphor for overcoming the giants in our own lives. The fears, challenges, and obstacles that seem too large to conquer. David's courage reminds us that no matter how impossible the situation may seem, with faith, we can overcome the giants that stand in our way. In the end, the story of David and Goliath is one of hope, faith, and the belief that with God, all things are possible. It is a reminder that even when we feel small and inadequate, God can use us to do extraordinary things.